Hey, what's up, folks? Today I'll be analyzing another game submitted to our Patreon page, and this one actually goes into a pretty interesting and I would say instructive endgame with opposite colored bishops. So this game was submitted by KirkD, and this was kind of a longer rapid game. I think both sides had 30 minutes for this game, played online. It starts off as the Sicilian, and I'll just quickly go through the opening. We actually get a pretty theoretical Sveshnikov defense, where black goes e5, knight d5, d6, bishop g5. And the players actually follow quite a bit of theory throughout the early middle game. So we get b5, knight d5, bishop e7, bishop takes f6. White gives up the dark squared bishop. This is all well known to establish this knight on d5. And in return, black gets the unopposed dark squared bishop and can one day hope to activate it. So c4, b4, knight c2, a5, and here Kirk plays g3. And actually, this is the setup I recommended in my book on the Open Sicilian a couple of years ago, where white tries to either fianchetto the light squared bishop or actually put it on somewhere like the h3 square after h4 and bishop h3. So black goes castles. Now white plays bishop to g2. And yeah, if I remember correctly, I think I was always a fan of this plan with h4, followed by playing bishop h3. Might be a different way to play the position, where the idea for white is to then kind of improve the king with king f1, king to g2. We definitely do not want to take on e6 and allow black to take over the d5 square, but we do want to kind of provoke black into trading off the light squared bishops one day to leave us with an unopposed knight on d5. So this is another way of playing. Theoretically, I'm sure black is doing fine here, but just for the interest of the position, I just wanted to show a different idea here. But okay, white plays bishop g2, bishop e6, castles, and here black decides to just take immediately on d5, which I think is very understandable. It's hard to play against this knight on d5, but to me it does give white kind of a small but lasting advantage, because I do believe that white's bishop here is often going to be better than its counterpart. In fact, there was definitely an argument to be made for playing c takes d5 here, because then we get a position with only one open c-file, and I think white can actually get there first with a move like bishop h3, or maybe h4 followed by bishop h3 to restrict black from using the g5 square. And yeah, I would say that white has a small advantage in this position. A lot of times black is playing knight b8 here. Knight d4 also makes sense, trying to get the knight over to the c5 square. And then here I would say it's probably accurate for white to start with h4, stopping bishop to g5, and then planning to bring the rook to c1, knight e3, bishop h3, knight to c4. And I feel like white has the more pleasant game on the light squares. In any case, we get queen takes d5, which also makes sense because white keeps some pressure on the d6 pawn. Black plays queen b6, kind of a nice trap. If we take, this often runs into some rook to d8, and the queen is probably going to get trapped. So queen b6, white goes b3, queen c5, white drops back, and now knight d4. And this actually turns out to be a tactical mistake, I think, missed by both players. Kirk plays rook d1 here. Actually could have taken on d4. I think probably we rejected this move because of e takes d4 and black gets a strong pass pawn. But if we look further, we notice that white has this thematic tactical shot with e5. Now maybe Kirk did see this. I don't think he mentions it in his notes. And maybe he didn't want to take this exchange necessarily, because at first glance it does look like maybe black has some nice compensation with these pawns in the center. But the pawns are well blockaded, and white can immediately play a move like f4 and get the rooks working. And I don't think black actually has enough here for the exchange. I think white has a clear advantage. So this was kind of a possibility, I think, missed. If queen takes d4, then same thing. We trade queens. We go e5. We win the exchange. And I think something like rook fe1, I think white should be clearly better here. The king can come in and defend against the pawns. And one day white does have a c-pawn that they can push to create significant counterplay. That said, we get rook ad1. And now maybe black noticed the threat and decides to go knight takes c2, which I think is, yeah, definitely a questionable move, as Kirk points out in the notes, because black can just keep the knight on d4, just get the rook off of the file with something like rook to b8, rook c8, any number of moves. And then the knight on d4 is quite strong and quite annoying for white to deal with. If white ever trades, then black does get kind of a nice pawn on d4. So black trades a little bit too quickly here. I would say a pretty typical mistake for players around this level and lower. They often make exchanges too easily. And now I think, yeah, white just has a clear advantage here because we can just pile up on the d-pawn. And with heavy pieces on the board, and this is something that's very important to understand about opposite colored bishops, is that you actually can create very serious winning chances. I think a lot of people hear opposite colored bishops and they think that the game is going to be drawn. But this actually, I think, is very far from the truth. In pure opposite color bishop endgames, then yeah, they have very drawish tendencies. You could be a pawn up, 2 pawns up in an endgame with opposite color bishops, no rooks on the board, and your opponent might still be holding a fortress. But with the rooks and queens on the board, the situation is very, very different because these pieces can put pressure and outplay each other. And then, if anything, the opposite color bishops only strengthen the side that's trying to attack. And there is this very well-known middle game principle or maxim, whatever you want to call it, that the side that is attacking has a big advantage when we have opposite colored bishops on the board because the defender cannot fight back on the square of our bishop, right? This dark square bishop cannot fight on the light squares. And conversely, if black were to get the initiative, then white would have a very hard time defending on the dark squares. So let's get to the endgame here. We get rook d5, queen c7, rook f d1. Black goes rook a6, and now queen to d3 from Kirk, threatening to possibly play c5. Kirk notes that he didn't want to play the immediate c5, which looks like a very nice move, just kind of opening everything up and activating white's pieces. The rook wants to get to d7 one day, and then white can start putting pressure on the f7 pawn. We can imagine a maneuver like bishop f1, bishop to c4, and it's going to be very, very hard for black to defend f7 in the long run. But Kirk notes he didn't like this because of rook to d8. And indeed, white cannot take on d6, and if rook takes d6, then black is actually just taking back, and white is losing material because queen on c2 is hanging. So this doesn't work for white, c5, rook d8, and then taking, but I do want to point out that in this position, white can simply reverse the move order and now play queen to d3, hitting the rook on a6, hitting the d6 pawn, and I think just winning a clear pawn and getting decisive advantage. So a little bit of a calculation slip, I think quite an interesting one. A lot of players do this. They see one line, it's not working, and then we don't work too hard to make it work, so to speak. Here, if white thought for a little bit longer, I think they could find the move queen to d3, and then, yeah, we have a decisive advantage. In any case, we get queen d3, rook a8 is played, and I think black realizes they can't really hold the pawn. If rook d8, then just c5, we transpose back, and white is winning. So rook a8, black gears up for the endgame, white wins this pawn, but does trade off some pieces, and we get left with this endgame with rooks and opposite color bishops, and white has a very healthy extra pawn. And I think white's winning chances here are quite decent. We have the extra pawn, it's a protected pass pawn, so quite a solid one. And in the long run, maybe we have chances of putting pressure on f7, something like bishop f1, bishop c4, and one day targeting this pawn. So with the rooks on the board, I think white has really good chances to win here. But if we traded the rooks off, and this is, I think, a really key point, then I would imagine black has zero problems in this position. The bishop can just come to e7 and c5, black gets a full blockade, and white will never be able to break through with the extra pawn. So black starts fighting for counterplay with a4. And of course, black has no way of forcing a trade of rooks, at least not necessarily a favorable one. If rook to d8, then white can just avoid it with something like rook a6, for example, and white is fine. So black goes a4, looking for counterplay. And I like how Kirk plays this part. He goes rook to d5. A very annoying move, actually, for black, because either black has to play bishop f6, and the bishop is passive, or black has to play f6 to defend this pawn, which kind of cuts the bishop away from the queen side. Then the bishop is blocked and can never get back. Black first takes on b3, a takes b3, and plays f6. And kind of a slip. I think black definitely should have thrown in rook a1 check, just to make white's bishop somewhat passive, and then figure out what to do about this pawn, maybe bishop f6, or maybe even just giving the pawn and playing for activity with something like king f8 would make sense here. Because I'm not sure this is really a pawn that white is going to be so happy about taking, as this would allow black to kind of reactivate the bishop. And that's what makes these endgames so interesting. It's not always clear whether you want to take specific pawns in the position, and sometimes you get a chance to win a pawn, but then you have to trade rooks. And then that's also not clear whether you want to do that, because by trading off the rooks here, white would be giving up a lot of winning chances, as we'll eventually see. So black goes for the immediate f6. White plays bishop h3, which I like, activating the bishop. Now black gives the check, king to g2. Here black goes rook to e1, bishop e6 check, king f8. And now white goes king to f3, which I certainly don't mind as a move. It makes a lot of sense. White pawn is under attack, and white should be defending this one. But white had a lot of more forcing ways of playing this endgame. And I think this is kind of an important point to make, because a lot of players, they try to win the endgame without any drama, without allowing black or their opponent any chances whatsoever, just winning straightforward move by move. But it's not always possible to win endgames like this. Sometimes you do have to take a bit of a risk, and you have to play a little bit more actively. And I think there was a couple of ways here for white to actually win the game in a much smoother way. Number one was just rook to b5. And here we're going after the b4 pawn. If black takes on e4 and allows us to take on b4, we're very happy to make this trade as white, because now we have two connected passers, and these are very strong. And in fact, here, with the two connected pass pawns, you could even trade the rooks as white, and you would be winning, because the two pawns run, and they're very, very strong. That's not always the case, but with so many pawns on the board, yeah, the two connected passers are, I think, just going to be decisive for white. And if bishop to d2, just defending the pawn, well, then I think white just starts running with c5, c6, and it's going to be really hard for black to deal with this pawn. I mean, the rook is coming to b7. We have rook f7 ideas, which is also just going to decimate the 7th rank. And yeah, we get so much activity just to give up, just for this one e4 pawn, that it's super, super worth it for white. So this was one way, just going rook to b5 and then pushing the c pawn. The other way was to just push the c pawn right away. And again, black really isn't in time to take on e4. White goes c6, and then the rook comes to d7. We're also just threatening the immediate c7 and c8. So actually, black doesn't even have a way to stop the immediate promotion of the pawn. So this is what I would kind of encourage folks to do in the endgame when you're winning or much better, you're looking to convert. It is good to kind of take it slow and not rush and improve your position. But at the same time, you also have to recognize when you have such a strong pass pawn and your opponent's bishop is stuck on the other side of the board, it's not like black's bishop is on this diagonal and is easily blockading the pawn. The king is also cut. The king is not defending against the pawn either. So when you have such a strong pass pawn, you have a more active rook, more active bishop, you really got to use your chances, I think, a little bit more aggressively. So this one would have been really good for white. And for example, if black plays rook to c1, I think a nice construction here would be to play bishop to d7, followed by putting the bishop on b5, playing c6, rook to d7, and I think that's just going to be hopeless for black. The pawn is coming to c7, eventually we get bishop a6, and we promote the pawn. And black's king is just going to be stuck on the 8th rank because white's rook is just going after all these pawns as well. So instead we do get king f3. Black goes rook to b1, rook d3, black plays h5, and now white finally pushes c5. And Kirk actually doesn't like this move. He gives this dubious, but I think this is the way white needs to be playing the position. We got to push the c-pawn if we're trying to win the game. But now black goes rook to c1, and yeah, it makes kind of a difficult decision for white because the pawn is under attack, and it seems like black wants to go rook to c3 and trading off the rooks in this opposite color bishop endgame. And so that's a big problem for white. Generally, we don't really want to trade rooks. We want to keep rooks on as much as we can, but what to do? Because the c-pawn is under attack. And in the game after rook to d5, Black ends up going rook to c3 and taking the b3 pawn. So I'll show you guys what happens in the game first. White plays king e2, black takes on b3, and white goes rook d8 check, king e7, and we end up getting this endgame with opposite color bishops, equal number of pawns, and it should be a dead draw. Instead, what white needed to do was play the move bishop to c4. And this is something that's kind of difficult to, I think, evaluate from afar, but the key point here is that when black is trading rooks, well, white does have one extra pawn already. Let's say king e2, rook takes d3, king takes d3. But I think this endgame is actually going to be very, very difficult for black to hold. And the reason for that, I would say, is because of the principle of two weaknesses. White already has one very strong asset, this passed c-pawn, but white also has ideas of going after black's king side. In fact, white's king is a very easy path to go king d5, king e6, king f7, and go after black's king side. Now, for example, here, if black plays king to e7, I think one thing that would be good to throw in for white is to play h4 at some point, kind of fixing this pawn on a light square. Later, Kirk writes in his notes actually that he wasn't sure what color square he should put his pawns on, and he was thinking maybe he should put them on the light squares so that they're not being attacked by the enemy bishop. In fact, what I would say, the general principle is that when you're playing for a win in an endgame with opposite color bishops, we want to keep our pawns on the opposite color of our bishop, and that's so that we can have targets, right? Because as a stronger side, we want to win pawns. We want to take all of the pawns in our opponent's position, and so it's very important to fix the enemy pawns on a light square so that this bishop can always go after them with a move like bishop f7 and taking. And I would encourage you guys to analyze this one deeper if you would like, but I do believe this one is going to be winning for white. Black's king is going to have to defend against the c-pawn. White will one day pick up the h5 pawn. The king will infiltrate over to the king side. And yeah, I think black is going to have a really hard time holding this position. Because once white wins the h5 pawn, we're going to have 4 versus 3 on the king side. And this is perhaps maybe the most important thing, or one of the most important things when it comes to opposite color bishop endgames. If you're the side that's playing for the win, you have one pass pawn, very rarely enough to win. You usually need at least 2 pass pawns. And somewhat counterintuitively, it's actually better if the 2 pass pawns are split, because the farther away they are, the harder it is for the enemy to defend against both of them. So if white can get 2 pass pawns, one on the queen side, one on the king side, that's just game over. We're going to promote one, and then the other one will win the game in the end. When I say promote, I mean we're going to promote one, force black to give up their bishop, and then the other pawn is enough to win the game. So stretching the opponent's defense is generally a very, very good thing in these kinds of endgames. So that one was kind of a tough one to figure out, and the key difference between this endgame and the one we get in the game is that white keeps the b3 pawn, which I think is very important because white also has an additional threat of just going after this b4 pawn, meaning black's bishop is always going to have to be in time to defend it. This is simply another weakness that white can possibly target, and so this gives white more winning chances in the position. Now the game finish is pretty interesting. So we get into this pure opposite colored bishops endgame. And yeah, at this point, I would say black should be well within range to draw this one, since we lost this b3 pawn, and now this b pawn is always a concern for white. And here black goes h4, which I think is absolutely the right move before white has a chance to play h4 themselves. Now Kirk could have played h4 here. Maybe this would have given him better chances, but I don't think white is in time. Black can play bishop c1, for example, bishop b2, bishop d4, and yeah, in the other variation, white might not have to be too concerned about this because we can go after the b4 pawn, but here black doesn't need the b4 pawn. Black just needs to get the bishop to d4 and go after white's pawn chain, because once white takes on b4, we're not getting 2 connected passers, we're still just left with the 1 pass pawn, so black really doesn't care about this b4 pawn. So bishop d5, now black goes h4, which I think is correct, because as a defender, you want to be kind of trading pawns off. Now white goes h3, and yeah, we discussed this already. I think keeping the pawns on the opposite color is probably better for the attacker. But I just want to get to the critical moment here. White keeps pressing, and this is something that I think Kirk does a very good job of. He doesn't just acquiesce to a draw, just keeps pushing, keeps fighting for the win. It's very important when you have any kind of endgame with possible winning chances that you try to win the game. You know, even if you believe it's a draw objectively, you should still try to pose some problems for the opponent, still make them work hard for that draw. Who knows, 1 out of every 10 games, 2 out of every 10 games you might win, and so that is going to add to your rating in the long run. So it's very important to actually try and put maximum pressure. So here white goes king e6, he gives up the c-pawn, takes on f6, black plays bishop f4. It's hard to imagine how black can lose this one, but white does have an idea here, and that is to play king to h5 and create another pass pawn on the king side. And so black can't really just sit around here. Black needs to create counterplay. If black does nothing, then white will create a pass g-pawn, and eventually the bishop will have to give itself up for the g-pawn, and white will be winning with an extra piece. So black plays king c3, white goes h4, takes, b3. Now white doesn't have to take back right away because we still have bishop a2 in the position. So white correctly goes g5. And here, unfortunately for black, they blow the game. They take immediately, which was simply inaccurate. Now I can understand why black was afraid of this one. g6, bishop h6 is not a concern. But white is wanting to play king h5 and then g6. And then black's bishop doesn't have a way to stop the pawn. There's no way to reach the g7 square. That said, black still can force white to spend another tempo with king h5 before taking on g5, right? So definitely not necessary. I see a lot of players do this. They kind of panic and they sack for the pawn too quickly because we're actually giving up some valuable time. I think the easiest way for black to have made a draw here would be through this move king to d4. And the point is that black is just trying to get rid of all the pawns. That's how you draw the game. So if white plays bishop takes b3, then black just takes on g5 with check, and the game is over. Black has saved it. If white tries something like king h5, because g6, bishop h6, black is fine here. So let's say king h5. Well, then black can force b2 and force white to stop the pawn with bishop a2. And then once again, first we take here, and then we take here. What we wouldn't want is to take on e4, white goes g6, and all of a sudden black can't stop the pawn, and white is winning the game. So no, here black could have still won all the pawns for the bishop and made a pretty easy draw. In fact, at this point, white has to make sure that they don't lose with something like check and king f5. So that was the way, but unfortunately for black, they panic a bit, they take. And now after king takes g5, b2, bishop a2, black is simply not in time. King d3, king f5 is already good enough, bishop b1 check also good, and the game was simply over. Black can try to go after white's bishop, but of course white is happily going to be giving up the bishop for the pawn and then just winning in the king and pawn endgame. And if king d2, then just king d4, defending the bishop, and there's nothing black can do. So, very interesting endgame. Thank you to Kirk for submitting this one. I think we discussed a lot of cool points there about the opposite color bishops. Some key takeaways to remember: you have to always mainly try to avoid trading rooks when you're the attacker, unless you're absolutely sure you're winning the pure bishop endgame. Number 2, we generally want to create weaknesses on multiple sides of the board, whether that's a pass pawn or going after our enemy pawns. And finally, when you're in the endgame, maybe one of the most important points, it's so important to just keep pushing and keep trying to grind for the win, not giving up, not saying to yourself, oh, it's just opposite color bishop, it's going to be easy draw. But keep pushing and try to convert these endgames, because you'll be surprised they can actually get pretty tricky for the opponent, and you can pick up a lot of points just by pushing endgames and trying to maximize your winning chances. All right, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully you found it instructive, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Take care.